Alright, behind me I have a list of parts that we still got to put on the outside of the engine. And we've already built the bottom in, put the pistons in, we've built the top in, put the timing chain on, adjusted all the tensioners, set up the alignment marks. So if you haven't seen those videos, the descriptions will be down below for those videos. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and put all the accessories on, the intake manifold, exhaust manifold, O2 sensor, spark plug wires, cap, all that stuff. Power steering pump, alternator, all those things, starter. So we're going to go ahead and do that. The reason we're doing that is just so that you guys can see where everything is located on this engine. Now I recommend if you're going to do this actual engine rebuild, you leave it just like you see right here and you install it just like that. Reason being is it's easier to get it in, especially with it being a manual. It's easier to get it in without any of the accessories on. No intake manifolds, none of that. You can put all that stuff on after the engine is already installed inside the engine or inside the car. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to assemble everything together so that you can see how everything's laid out and how everything's hooked up. Then I'm going to remove those parts back off, and then we're going to install this engine inside the car, and then we're going to put all the accessories back on. Okay? Partly because you can't see behind everything, the firewall and where the starter and alternator, power steering pump, you can't see any of that stuff through video purposes. We're going to film it this way so you can see how everything is installed and mounted to the engine. Then we go ahead and we're going to put the engine in the car, and we're going to actually sell the car with the engine inside it. I already have somebody who wants to buy it. So that's kind of the status with the Saturn. So I'm going to go ahead and get started for today. And if you guys have any questions on the sequence, how everything's hooked up, what bolts need to be removed, like the power steering pump's kind of confusing. So I'll show you how all that's set up as best I can as we start to install all the external accessories on the engine block. So here we go. Let's go ahead and get started. Alright, I think the first thing we're going to start with is the thermostat, which goes right here. And we have two 13mm bolts. And we also have another housing down here, which we might actually have to put in first. Let me grab that real quick. We might actually want to put this in first. That's the water pump out. So I might have a socket that actually fits that. If you don't, you can just use a crescent wrench. Take this thermostat housing off, and you can just use a big crescent wrench, which I think I have. And I believe it's a 22mm. If you're going to actually use the socket, it looks like it's a 21mm, either 21 or 22. But I'm just going to use that. Then we are going to, here's our thermostat right here. And if you need to actually remove the thermostat, the way this works, so what you have to do is you have to push it in. Okay, it's kind of tight. You just push it in and turn it, and that'll release the thermostat. But it's easier to do with like some pliers or something. But that's how you remove the thermostat. But this is the housing for it. Go ahead and tighten those down. Next step, we're going to take and put our dipstick in. Okay, just push it down in the block, and we have a 10mm bolt right there. All right, right underneath the thermostat and the heater hose is the plug. Now this goes in right into the block. It's a 10mm, and that will actually drain out the coolant out of the block. So when you ever want to flush out the system, this is where you want to tap into that drain plug. Now this just taps out the coolant. This is separate from the oil. Okay, now we're going to move to the front of the engine. I'm going to install the water pump. Now it only goes one way. You see there's a line right here. Just match that line up. Now we'll also need to make sure that you put some of that sealant here, the gasket sealant. Now we're just dry assembling this for you guys so you know how everything's connected. So we have 6 10mm bolts. We'll tighten these down and then we'll come back and put on the pulley. All right, now that I got the water pump in place, just gonna line up the pulley. Got 3 10mm bolts for that as well. Go ahead and zip those down. Now we are going to put on the idler pulley. It goes right there in the middle. And then this is a 14mm. Okay, now this next clip we're going to be putting on the belt tensioner. It goes right here. All right, and we got a 10mm bolt here and another 10mm bolt here. All right, now our next step, we're just going to put on the pulley. And this is a 13mm. Okay, and you can see how the tensioner works. Okay, this is the tensioner. Then this one right here is the idle pulley. Okay, our next step, we're going to be putting the alternator on, which mounts here and here. We have one long bolt and one short bolt. The way this works, position it into place, slide it up a little bit. You want to put the long bolt in first, kind of the pivot bolt. And there is a nut on the back side. And just slide this up. And there's a nut from this side. I'll go ahead and zip those down. I believe I put this on backwards. I'm going to remove that pulley. I believe this thing goes the opposite direction. I'm not exactly sure, but it just didn't seem like it had enough clearance around the alternator. Once I got the alternator in place, it seemed like it was just a little tight. And I can't remember if it goes this direction or the other direction. Sometimes when you're doing automotive repair, sometimes you have to do things twice. So not always the most comfortable, but sometimes that happens. So I'm just going to try to flip it the other way because I think it actually mounts right here. Yeah. Yep. I think that's the right direction because then that way the pulley mounts there. I think that was right. So I'm going to go ahead and zip this back down and tighten it up. And just remember when you're taking things apart and putting them back together, that's why you take pictures so that you remember how things go back together. If you're trying to do this inside the car, and obviously it mounts both ways, you always want to make sure that you've taken the time to do it correctly, and always want to make sure you check your pictures that you did install it right, not backwards like I just did. And I'm thinking that's the way it goes, like that. Yep. So it just seemed like it was really close to this alternator after I got the alternator installed. So then that way you kind of look through things. Now the next thing we're going to do is move to the other side, start working on the starter, the crank sensor, the plugs, and the alternator. We're going to hook that up to the starter, and I'll show you how on the other side. All right, so one last look so you can see how it's set up on this side. All right, now we're going to move over here and start installing the starter and these plugs. Okay, so I turned the engine over on the side a little bit just so it's easier to get to. This right here is the crank sensor. This measures the position of the crank, and so that as the engine's rotating, the computer knows exactly where that crank is located. So that's what this switch is. Okay, and then we have two plugs that we took out that have an Allen bolt. It looks like it's about a T, I don't know, maybe like a 9. I'm not sure. But that's the size of the bolt. So these are both plugs right here. Okay. Then we have another sensor. This right here is the oil pressure sensor. You can see by the little hole in it. And it goes right here. Maybe I'm lying. Maybe, sorry. Yeah, back up. The oil pressure switch goes right behind the alternator, okay, because it has a little hole in it. So I'll thread that in here, and then the two plugs go back here. We want to make sure we get these plugs on and this crank sensor on before we actually put the starter on. It'd be kind of awkward after that. So I'll tighten these down. And then right here we have what's called the knock sensor. The knock sensor does just that. It measures the amount of noise inside the block. So if you throw a rod or something like that, that knock sensor tells you that your engine's got some issues, and it'll turn your engine light on so that make sure you know that you've got an engine problem. Okay, so I'll go ahead and zip these down. I figure since we're here, go ahead and put the oil filter on. Now this is an MGL 3614, and it goes right here. Okay. Now we're going to put the starter on. Actually, one more thing before we put the starter on. We're going to put on this solenoid. I believe this is a purge solenoid for the fuel rail, and that goes right here. There's a little notch here in the back, and then 10mm bolt, and we'll zip that down. Then we can put the starter on. All right, now we're going to put our starter on. And it just goes right here. Now this is all the back side of the engine where the firewall is. We have two bolts, both 13mm. We'll go ahead and tighten those down now. You see why it's important to get those plugs and everything in position and the crank sensor before we try to put this on. Okay, so now we'll tighten those down.